Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming through.
Okay. Well, when we think about the Peloponnesian War, and people think about protests to war, reasons why we wouldn't want to be going to war, you would think about Aristophanes and the Lysistrata and the peace, Dicæopolis in Acharnians trying to find his own private peace. But of course, these are all comic responses. And it's not always clear that we're supposed to even believe that there were these sentiments in Athens. So one of the questions I want to ask about Euripides today is that his tragedies are very distressing. They show a lot about the collateral damage of war, the fallout of war. But does he himself and his audience accept that war is inevitable? Is there an idea that you mustn't commit war crimes and that you need to respect the gods, but that war is something, well, it's just part of human nature. It can't be avoided. And so, you know, you can study it, you can be interested in it because it's just part of life. Well, now Euripides is not explicitly anti-war in any of the plays he anyway. And even cases where plays are extremely disturbing, something like the Trojan Women, people in the past have tried to say, oh, this must be a reaction. And, you know, the Milos crisis, was Trojan Women meant to tell the Athenians off about how they were behaving in their own war? Well, that sort of approach has generally been discarded these days because the timing's not right, because there are all sorts of problems with interpreting plays on their own as apart from outside the trilogy. But we're still left to think, well, Euripides writes a lot of plays about war, about what's happening in the Trojan War, and is there an acceptance that this is just the way the world is? So I want to show you a few bits and pieces of evidence today, just to think about that idea, because the way we approach the Peloponnesian War, and we look at our texts and we look at our documentary histories, might suggest that the Athenians were just interested in the strategy, in the gains that could be made, that they thought war was essentially a sort of a neutral thing, perhaps, that they should be getting involved with. And it was just about how you conducted the war that mattered. It was about war is okay, but war crimes are not. Well, if we think about what Euripides has to tell us about this, and I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Here we go. Well, one reason to think that Euripides and his audience might have accepted that warfare was just part of the way the world is that the gods are doing it. The gods have fights amongst themselves, they have full-blown war, and we hear in tragedy ideas that in fact the gods have been supporting various battles and so on. One of the most explicit comments is from Euripides' Helen, where we are told that Zeus was responsible for the whole beginning and outcome of the Trojan War. He stirred war between the Greeks and the Phrygians. Aesinenken, he actually brought it in upon them. Why was this? Well, in order to ease Mother Earth's burden, the overpopulation, the ochlu broto, and to bring glory to the greatest of the Greeks. So if we think, well, you know, the gods are not just allowing it, but using it, supporting warfare as part of human life, maybe we just have to accept it. Some of the problems with accepting that view would be, first of all, who tells us these things in tragedy? Well, this is the view of Helen, who was born from an egg, who has been sequestered in Egypt away from everything that's going on. She perhaps doesn't have a nice, clear perspective on what's happening. And although this sounds quite neat and quite tidy, when we then get Teucer coming in later on, he gives us a much darker view of what's going on. So this is in no sense meant to be some sort of cleaning of the world, even though that's how it's presented in Helen's phrase. So anybody who talks about war in these slightly odd metaphorical terms is often seen as being problematic. If you think about the gods in general, well, Euripidean tragedy is full of characters saying the gods should be better than humans. Just because the gods do it doesn't mean we should. So I think we have to say that although Euripides may be accepting that these things happened in the past, he isn't necessarily saying we should still follow those examples and we should accept war as it exists. So one of the subsequent questions from this is it possible to have war without war crime? Is Euripides just telling us, well, yes, you can have war, but you need to conduct it in a certain manner? If you look at the plays that we've got, I don't think you can support that view either, because the most famous war, the Trojan War, Euripides talks about it a lot. He talks about the fallout, the collateral damage. He also gives us some very, very dark images of how people rationalize warfare and acts in warfare. One of the most horrific outcomes of the Trojan War, the Iliopersus, death of the Stein axe. And this is one version that we get in a lot of archaic vase painting. This is a black figure amphora. This is Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, killing Priam on the altar by using the body of his dead grandson, a Stein axe, and actually beating him with a club. So that's pretty horrific. We would probably say, well, that's a war crime. That is not something that you would say were acceptable. But if we go to the Trojan Women, we get a slightly less explicitly violent take on this. We get Althybius, the herald, saying, actually, what's going to happen is your son, the Stein axe, is going to die. He says, Odysseus decreed that your son must be thrown to his death on the walls of Troy. He said we could not allow an enemy's child to grow up. Now, is that a war crime? Well, Odysseus would say it's pragmatism. It's trying to draw a line under the war once and for all. You don't want a cycle of endless warfare. You have to make some hard choices in order to have a solution. So I think we've got to a point where we can say Euripides, even talking about the Trojan War, doesn't seem to be telling us through positive characters that war is acceptable. He isn't drawing a clear distinction between acts that are acceptable and acts that aren't. So, is there any war without war crime? I think probably Euripides would say no. And one of the things that his tragedies are doing are making you focus on the less sanitized versions of war that are going on around him. When you study the Peloponnesian War, it's very easy to get excited about drawing the maps, to think about the strategies. Perhaps some of you have done little sort of war games where you worked out what you would have done in a different situation. And that sort of impetus to think about wars as glorious, as intellectual puzzles and so on, can very easily hide the realities of war. And I think even for the Greeks, who had a lot of experience and knew what it was like on a personal basis, there was a tendency perhaps to forget some of the darker, inevitably painful parts of war. And really, I think that's what Euripides tends to do. It's not so much an ethical push about a particular warfare strategy or a particular war. It is simply trying to remind people that it is impossible to have war without war crimes. That the idea of there being a sort of a Geneva Convention in itself is, for many people, morally problematic because it's somehow accepting that war is inevitable. So if we think about the Greek world, one of the great reasons for war, one of the things that is supposed to mitigate against all the horrors, is, of course, the question of glory, respect, honor. So you have to fight for the respect of your city, you have to fight for your property, you have to fight to be respected in the world. Now, Euripides has quite a lot to say about this, and I'm just going to give you quite an impressionistic end to my talk, to throw some ideas out and ask you to think, what does this make you now look at when you look back at the Peloponnesian War? What exactly is Thucydides missing out? What should we be holding up against Thucydides? Because really, when you're reading an account of what happened in Sicily or how the Spartans were camped out besieging Athens, you really need to be reading Euripides' plays alongside it, and you need to have two visions. And I think that that's what Euripides was giving to his Greek audience. Euripides' last play, Iphigenia in Aulis. This is obviously meant to show us questions about how warfare begins, about the justification for warfare. What can you legitimately sacrifice in order to achieve a goal? Well, the answer is Euripides says, well, some people say you can actually sacrifice anything. Agamemnon and Menelaus have brought Iphigenia there to sacrifice her, maybe to the gods, maybe to Artemis, but also maybe just because there is a lust for warfare, a blood feud that's going on. What's interesting for me about this play is the presentation of Achilles, because he is a sort of a lightning rod to understand Greek ideas towards glory, heroism, battle, and so on. And we're familiar with the idea that in the Iliad, he's the great hero, he's made his choice. And in the Odyssey, in Odyssey 11, we see him questioning that again and thinking, maybe I shouldn't have gone to war, maybe it would have been better to live. Well, Iphigenia in Aulis is the earlier stage of the story. He, of course, does not need to be there. He has not sworn any sort of oath to go and defend Menelaus' bride. And when he realizes how things are being set up, that Iphigenia has been brought there to be killed, he brought there under false pretenses, he says, no, I'm not going to let this happen. We're not going to put the needs of warfare, the needs of Greece, ahead of the rights of a child to live. And even when he has heard her eventual speech about why this should happen, that she's going to sacrifice herself for Greece and all of this, he says, oh, this is wonderful, what a great woman. But he still says, actually, you might change your mind. And for me, the interesting thing is not so much about Iphigenia changing her mind. It's the idea that her decision is still really, really odd. And then Achilles still says, well, you might change your mind. And if you do change your mind, the right thing will be for me to fight for your life, not to go to war, not to pursue my own glory. He actually says, I'll die for you. I'll die for that principle, rather than sacrificing it all for life, for war. I'll sacrifice it for life and not for death. Now, the chorus just before this have said to Iphigenia, oh, what a wonderful thing you've just decided on. How noble. And they say, ton men sono genaios eches. Isn't this wonderful, a noble frame of mind? But of course, they do call her young one. And Achilles is very young in this story as well. So for me, what Euripides is pointing at when he's talking about the glory of war is always that glory is perhaps an immature response, that it doesn't outweigh all the horrors, all the war crimes that are there. So when I read this bit of Iphigenia, what comes to mind for me, of course, is this, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. This is the Horatian phrase about, putting yourself forward. And does this mean, even if war is not acceptable, it is a good thing because it brings you glory? Or is war acceptable because it's inevitable, and then you focus on glory as something positive to come out of it? Well, I don't think Euripides agrees with that. And I think Euripides would be much more inclined to agree with Wilfred Owen. And Euripides gives us a portrayal of war which is much more like the horror of the First World War. Next, to see a fumbling, fitting the clumsy hands just in time, someone was still yelling out and stumbling, foulundering in a man in fire or line. As under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. And then we come back to the young people and the glory. If you had seen all of this, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is for children that this story about glory ultimately is there in Euripides. So what I would say is that he is not accepting that warfare exists, not accepting that there can be a proper form of war. He is saying there cannot be war without war crimes. So if you are thinking about the Peloponnesian War, you cannot just think about the strategies, about the battle plans, about the moving and trying to get territory, like the Athenians got caught up with, oh, let's go and have Sicily, lots of money in Sicily. What you have to be thinking about, I would say, according to Euripides, is unfortunately this. And Euripides is giving you this, not preaching at you about any particular war, but is simply telling you war is not acceptable, that there cannot be an acceptance of war, even in the Greek world, where we think of war as being almost central to community identities. And that is me for today.